Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Montag and I'm the Director of Projects Finance at NGen. Today I will be walking you through the information on the funding process, eligibility of project expenses, and the claims portal. This information can also be found on our website. The objective of this presentation is to help you understand and navigate the funding rules, make it as easy as possible to obtain funding quickly, making the process as smooth as possible, answer any questions up front, and to prepare your company and NGen for any future audits and adjustments by the federal government. Just a reminder, this isn't a granting program. This is a reimbursement model. Funding is based on direct, supportable, and eligible project costs. You will have a project budget that is outlined on the Master Project Agreement, and your cost will need to fit within those defined budgets or a recorded approved change request. So just to speak a little bit to the financial due diligence process, or FDD. This is something that we require all project companies to do. The lead will need to secure permission and consent from all partners for FDD and confirm that to us by clicking the Agree to Financial Due Diligence checkbox in the application. It's highly confidential as we're often dealing with sole proprietorships. Each partner company, not just the lead, will submit their information directly to NGen through our secure portal. It will take some time for us to be able to go through this process and review submitted documentation and financials, and this is something that we do require to be completed before projects move into assessment. So please be diligent on getting back to us when we send out that request. We require all FDD documentation to be provided to NGen by the intake deadline. Earlier is better, and we will use the following weeks for NGen feedback to request further information if required. Starting with the application process, the first step of the financial review is the FDD. The reason this is required is that we know that each partner is going to be making a financial commitment to be able to complete the project, and we need to confirm that they have the financial wherewithal to support the full scope of the project. So let's talk a little bit about the project financial planning process. Reading and well understanding the guides, what's eligible and what's not, will help you avoid an embarrassing situation with your leadership, because they have a different expectation on what they can be reimbursed for and what we will allow. For example, when you would typically use a fully burdened engineering overhead rate, but we can only accept straight labor plus statutory benefits, there's an enormous difference there. Understand that this is meant to be a collaborative Canadian initiative. Projects that wish to hire offshore labor to minimize costs will be forced to prove that this function or effort cannot be acquired from resources within our borders. Costs, particularly labor, are expected to be incurred in Canada, and if that's not completely possible, i.e. it doesn't exist in Canada, there is a way to get an exception, but it's a rigorous process. We have several limits, as you can see, on what percent of the project can be subcontracted or capital, for example. All of these limits are in the guide and will be laid out further in the presentation. As mentioned, once you understand what's eligible and what's not, and it's clearly conveyed to your senior management, then you can properly put together the finance plan for your project. You'll be working with your engineers and your senior management to create the budget. Don't use our spreadsheets to do that. First, they're all protected, so they're not really friendly for your purposes. Second, you'll miss stuff that should be in your cost base for your purposes, but we may not reimburse it. Identify in your budget which items are reimbursable by us and link them into the finance workbook. Next, put some words around the numbers. Tying a piece of equipment or an individual to a specific work package, or explaining the tie-in from the expense to your project plan will help the assessors make sense of your budget. Then remember, this is a budget. What's more, it's development work. You don't know what you don't know, and as you work through your project, you're sure to change direction. That's okay. There are mechanisms called a project change request, or PCR, to move funds around within our limits and within your budget cap. Claims approval goes much more smoothly when our claims team can follow your claim back to a budget line item, so being detailed in your budget or PCR will make your claims process more quickly too. The project is meant to be collaborative. Some of the evidence we expect to see to support the collaborative nature is a split of the costs. We require the funding split to make sure that all partners have skin in the game, because we know a common objective with partners that have skin in the game will provide synergies one company can't get on its own, and provide growth opportunities to a wider base. Now we will talk a little bit about what expenses can be claimed. Do note this is a general summary. Please refer to your finance contact or the guide for specific eligibility. As a preface for preparing your financial workbooks, you will want to be familiar with the Project Finance Guide. You can find them on our website at the link shown here. These are great references when creating your financial workbook and submitting your claims. We will go through some of the key points of this guide within this presentation. The type of costs that are eligible for NGen funding are defined by the Pan-Canadian Artificial Intelligence, or PCAS, funding rules. So they are not just our rules, they're ISED, or the Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada rules. This program will fund 35% of eligible expenses with no single project participant receiving more than 80% of project funding. Basically, if you're a company incorporated in Canada, whether for-profit or not-for-profit, and you're an NGen member, you're eligible. Generally, expenses must be new to the business or additional, reasonable, and directly relate to eligible activities of the project. Remember the term additional, as it will surface a couple of more times through this discussion. That generally means that the cost is not part of your normal business. You would not have incurred this cost at this time in this magnitude if not for the project. In-kind costs are not reimbursable and no overhead costs are allowed. Claims must be done on a cash basis, meaning only expenses that you have incurred and actually paid may be claimed within a project period. Expenses must be submitted net of any sales tax. Claimed salaries and wages costs must reflect the labor you've incurred, so hourly rates you are reporting must tie back to payroll registers. Timesheets and payroll registers will be required to support the hours claimed towards NGen projects and should indicate the activities contributed towards the project. Only claim non-discretionary benefits such as CPP, EI, EHT, WSIB. Those are eligible, and these should be prorated to the hours worked on the project. No discretionary benefits or pensions can be claimed. Costs for routine administration are ineligible, but administration of project activities is allowed if you can provide reasonable support in the form of timesheets. Labor and subcontract costs are expected to be incurred in Canada, and if that's not completely possible, i.e. it doesn't exist in Canada, there is a way to get an exception, but it is a rigorous process. There is a limit on the total amount of subcontracted costs that can be covered in the project. This is a project-based limit, not an individual company limit, so you could have one company with higher than 40% of their costs subcontracted as long as another company has less. Project participants cannot be subcontracted to another partner when it comes to labor. Subcontract must be reasonable and accounted for at fair market value. You can refer to the CRA definition of related companies on the slide once it's available online. Labor and subcontracted costs are expected to be incurred in Canada, and again, if that's not possible, there is a way to get around it, but it's a rigorous process. You have to prove that it's not available anywhere inside of Canada's borders. NGen funds up to 100% of the acquisition cost of new, as in new to you, equipment, and cannot exceed 45% of the value of total project costs. Used equipment is eligible. Cash payments towards equipment under financing arrangements are eligible to the extent paid during the project term, but this excludes interest. So here we're talking about the principal portion of the lease, not the interest. If you lease an asset, we'll contribute during the project period, after which it's on your account. Therefore, to make the most out of our funding, it'd be best to purchase the equipment outright, borrow if needed, rather than taking up a lease. Again, the interest portion on the loan would not be eligible, but we would pay the reimbursement rate on the total cost of the asset. Any existing equipment that you already have to carry out use to carry out project activities cannot be claimed. Remember, we're looking for additional spend, so it has to be purchased after your project has been approved. However, you can claim direct costs of existing equipment incurred to run that equipment. So materials consumed on that existing equipment and utility costs on that existing equipment can be claimed if they're metered. If there's a single asset that you're buying and it's over $1 million, that requires pre-approval from NGen. So get in touch with us if that's in your project. Now, when we say single asset, you need to include the cost of getting that asset into service. So if you have a press worth $950,000 and you need electrical wiring for $60,000 and rigging of $25,000, then you're over $1 million. To put that into service, you need to get it pre-approved. You're allowed to purchase equipment from foreign sources without pre-approval, assuming it's under $1 million. Materials consumed in development quantities are eligible for reimbursement. Be careful, not production levels of material. If a partner wants to sell material to another partner within the project, it must be done at cost, supported with purchase invoices from third-party vendors. If through your development process you produce samples resulting in offal or scrap that has a significant resale value, the expectation is that the charge will be net of scrap. This is the sort of cost that can be reviewed by the Auditor General, so it's important that you maintain your record keeping. For travel costs, the National Joint Council Travel Directive is the base guideline. Costs are required to support project activities. Familiarize yourself with the directive if you haven't already, but understand that the one key message here is alcohol is not an eligible expense. Some of the other key categories of eligible costs are outlined on the next couple of slides. Any cost claimed must be incurred as part of project activities, so we may ask you to demonstrate that as part of your claim. Any selling, marketing, or advertising costs, including travel and labor related to these activities, are not eligible. Various other smaller categories of spend, costs for software licenses that are new and used directly for project activities may be eligible, subscription fees reimbursable during the project period, rental space, productive and lab space, but not admin space, as long as it's contracted after the kickoff of the project and wouldn't have been incurred if not for the project, may be eligible. Conference costs may be eligible in a very limited circumstance. If you were to host a hackathon that contributes directly to your project, that's a good example of an eligible conference cost, but industry conferences and the related travel are generally not eligible. Dissemination costs, not marketing costs, are eligible for funding, and only SMEs may obtain funding for IP and patent costs, but there's a limit set up in the finance guide capped at $200,000 per SME. In the project finance guide, there's a detailed list of ineligible costs that may not be funded. Key ineligible costs are sales taxes, costs of routine administration and operation, costs unrelated to project activities, costs already covered by other government funding sources, infrastructure costs or costs related to construction or building purposes. Costs that will also not be funded are any in-kind contributions, as only cash costs can be reimbursed. If you are receiving any other government funding that is used towards the eligible costs of this project, so costs that you will be claiming funding for, you will be required to disclose that to NGen. The stacking limit for the NGen program is 100%, so you can only utilize government funding up to 100% on the project. However, if you are receiving funding from other government programs and they have a stacking limit that is lower, say 75%, the lower stacking limit applies. For example, if you had received funding from the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, you would need to consider any potential funding from NGen when you are applying, as we would not reconcile those costs for you. It is your obligation to ensure that you claim labor costs correctly without double dipping government funding. So now that we've gone through at a high level what's in the finance guide, you'll be ready to start filling out the finance workbook. You can find it on our website at the link you see here. A workbook is required for each individual partner. Each partner will need to submit their own workbook and submit it as part of the application. This outlines the partner's project budget and is reviewed by NGen for eligibility of costs, and we ask that you provide sufficient detail of the proposed expenses so that we are able to assess the eligibility of costs and the applicability to the project. Once workbooks are submitted by the intake deadline, we will review and provide feedback to your workbooks. This allows you to incorporate that feedback into your workbooks for assessment. If you are successful with the assessment, we will then do a more detailed review of the workbooks and all of the eligibility pieces, and that will end up representing your budget and will be outlined in your MPA. Now I'm going to talk just a little bit about the funding process. Claims are made on a reimbursement basis and after review and approval of eligible costs at your reimbursement rate. Claims are to be submitted every 3 months and are usually paid within 45 days. These dates are stipulated in the MPA. NGen will apply a 15% holdback, the last 15% of the project, until all of the project closeout documents, not just finance support, this refers to all IP documents, etc., that are monitored through the project, are submitted and approved. NGen reimburses based on claims, and you will submit those claims to us through a portal. We will talk about that process next. Only eligible project costs, as defined by the Pan-Canadian Artificial Intelligence Strategy, may be claimed for funding from NGen. So again, refer to our guides we just went through. Please note that only expenses incurred after the project start date can be claimed. All claims for reimbursement submitted to NGen require supporting documentation. We work on a cash basis, so only costs that have been incurred and paid within the project period may be claimed. Claims will be reviewed alongside project monitoring of your project and its progress towards project deliverables or milestones. So in order to validate your claim submissions, you will need to supply some documentation to support the cost. For example, timesheets reflecting the hours incurred toward the project activities and copies of invoices over $500. For labor rate support, you will be required to submit payroll registers with your first claims for an individual and then whenever the rate for that individual changes. Evidence of payment is required only on payments greater than $250,000, but of course you are still subject to audit on that with the Auditor General and us if we get audited. Please note that you will be required to keep a record of all supporting documents for at least 7 years after completion of the project in the case of an audit, which the Government of Canada reserves the right to do. The finance team will reach out to the project lead and partners to set up user registration on the portal and provide you with a user guide for it. Note that each organization within the project will be submitting claims for the project costs they have incurred and paid. Your claim will normally be processed within 45 days, providing that all supporting documentation is in order. We ask that you provide as much information or context in the claim as possible to help us understand the claim and make it an easy review process. The finance team will be trying to link your expense back to a line item in your finance workbook or PCR if there's a post-approval budget change. So again, the more detail in your finance workbook and the claim, the easier it will be for finance to approve the claim without a question from them. User guides and webinars can be found in the FAQ section on the top ribbon of the claims portal. So to be clear, this is not claims submissions training. It's just a sneak peek at what the screen looks like. When you are approved, finance will provide a webinar and training documentation to you to complete your claim submissions. This is a snapshot of some of the sections within the claim form that clearly outline the level of detail we require on each line item of your claim. There's a section for you to upload all of the attachments supporting documentation that we outlined before, such as timesheets when it comes to labor costs and invoices over $500 for other costs. A few tips. Multiple invoices can be uploaded via a zip folder. You don't have to wait to the end of the quarter to load your claims. You only have to wait to the end of the quarter to hit the submit button. So if you load your claims monthly or even weekly, so that there's no delay in your submission and reimbursement. Provide as much detail as possible, such as the role in the project for labor or how expenses relate to project deliverables. This will assist us in the claim review. Once a claim is returned to you for edits, our feedback can be viewed in the NGen feedback section within each line item of the claim. When a claim is returned to you to address feedback or if it is approved, The portal users will get an automated notification. Enter 1 line per invoice. Finally, at the end of this claim form, there's a link to download the FCC or Finance Claim Certification. And all claims must attach this form signed by the CFO, your VP Finance, or their delegate. This person will need to attest to the costs of the claims being directly related to project activities, that only eligible costs have been claimed, and that claims have been incurred and paid in cash. And it will include any disclosure for any other government funding or subsidies you are receiving that directly relate to the project's eligible costs. This concludes the finance material for this presentation. Once again, the biggest piece of advice I can provide for you is to carefully read the finance guide and ensure your team understands what costs are eligible. Thank you for your time.